Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Touch Base Tuesday. Today we're going to talk about FSMA's Sanitary Transport Rule. Before we get started, I want to make sure everyone can hear me. So I would like you to type into chat where you are located. You can type the city or the state. I am in Emeryville, California. So if you would please type into chat so I can know where you are and I can know that you hear me. Okay. Welcome to Petaluma, LA, Utah, North Carolina, okay, looks like most of you can hear me. If you can't hear me, obviously, you wouldn't be able to type into chat. So let's get started. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am Margaret Kolk. I am the Director of Agriculture, Food Safety, and Training for SCS Global Services. And actually, what I'd also like to know is if you've attended a Touch Base Tuesday, or if you have attended one of my webinars in the past, that would be nice too if you could type that into chat. I'd appreciate that. We have some more people from Visalia, Portland, Oregon. Again, welcome to the webinar. Let me tell you a little bit about SCS Global Services. We are a third-party certification body. We work in the food safety and environmental arena. We've been around since 1984. We are a global company. We've got a network of trainers, auditors, and staff and affiliates all throughout the country, and that little map there just shows you a little bit of where we are and where our offices are. And this is just a list of the certifications that we offer, as well as the training and the testing that we offer. Not too much about that. Just thought I'd give you an idea. If you don't know anything about us, oops, I skipped one here. Again, we do not offer consulting services. However, we have a consultants network. We do offer training and we do offer certification. Okay, Food Safety Modernization Act. Now I'm going to ask you all to please type into chat some responses to questions that I have for you. Specifically, how many of you, hi Lori, thank you. Oh, that's really sweet, thank you. What I'd like you to do is type into chat if you are required to comply with any of the following FSMA, whoops, I'm going a little too fast here, FSMA rules. So we have the preventive controls rule for human food, the preventive controls rule for animal food, the produce safety rule, the foreign supplier verification program. So if you are importing food into the United States, you are required to comply with the foreign supplier verification program rule. Then we have third-party certification, and that probably does not apply to you. And today we are going to be talking about the sanitary transport rule, and my assumption is that you either must comply with that because you're on this webinar, or you're interested in learning more about the sanitary transport rule. And then, of course, we have the intentional adulteration, or what we call the food defense rule. And so what I have up on the screen now is the last three of the 7 rules, and we are going to be focusing on sanitary transport. Requires transporters, and I'm going to be talking about the definition of a transporter, what transportation actually means, and what the requirements in order to comply with the sanitary transport are. So the sanitary transport rule is actually based on the 2005 Sanitary Food Transportation Act. And as all of these regulations, they're all built upon preventive concepts. So there are 4 regulated entities, or 4 entities that are covered. Actually, FDA calls them persons or people, but it really is the entity itself that's covered. So it's the shipper, the receiver, the loader, and the carrier, any of whom are transporting food in the United States by motor or by rail, and this applies to intrastate shippers as well. So shippers who are outside of the United States when food is shipped by motor or rail, let's say from Canada or Mexico, or when shipping a container into the U.S. and the foreign shippers arrange for transport of the intact container or continuation of the rail or truck shipment into commerce within the United States. So those are all the entities that are covered. So if the foreign shipper arranges for transportation for the product once it gets into the United States, either by rail or by motor, they're also covered as well. Okay, let's see, anybody answer my questions? Lori says yes, a number of these apply. Annette said foreign supplier verification program. Then Annette, I would assume that you're also required to comply with the preventive controls for human food. I could be wrong, but maybe not. Okay, so thank you for answering my questions. Let's see, we have some more answers. Yes, okay. Thank you for answering my questions. It makes it a little bit more engaging for me, and then I know you're listening whenever you answer my questions. So thanks, I appreciate that. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of background on the sanitary transport rule. The rule was proposed rule February 5th, 2014. More than 200, probably, that might be a typo, I think it might be 2,000, more than 2,000 comments, public comments. And those of you who are familiar with the rule process, the proposed rule is presented to the public and is open for comment for a certain period of time after the rule has been presented. FDA looks at all of the comments on the rule, and then they make a decision on what the final rule will be. So the final rule went on display April 5th, 2016. And the message is it builds safeguards that were envisioned, actually the original Sanitary Food Transportation Act was first introduced back in 1990. So Congress actually passed the Sanitary Food Transportation Act, and they delegated the authority to implement the law to the Department of Transportation. Then they passed the Sanitary Food Transportation Act in 2005. They reallocated the authority for food transportation safety to FDA, Department of Transportation, and the USDA. And now FDA now has the lead role among all the federal agencies in regulating the safety of food during transport. However, both the Department of Transportation and the USDA also play a role as partners with the FDA in the broad federal food safety structure, as I'm sure you're well aware. Okay, so who's covered under this rule? The final rule applies to shippers, as I said earlier, receivers, loaders, carriers who transport food in the United States by motor or rail vehicle, whether or not the food is offered for or enters interstate commerce. So, except for some exemptions, the final rule applies to those that I just mentioned, and we're going to dig deeper into more of that. I'm going to identify and define. These are FDA definitions of what is the shipper, what is the loader, carrier, and receiver. So the shipper means a person, and again, as I said, FDA defines these terms using the term person, who arranges for the transportation of food in the United States by a carrier or multiple carriers sequentially. So examples of a shipper might be the manufacturer, the broker, the freight broker. The loader means the person who loads food onto a motor or rail vehicle during transportation operation. Okay, so they prepare and they load the food onto the vehicle. The carrier means the person who physically moves the food by rail or by motor vehicle in commerce within the United States. So remember, this is a U.S. law, so it only applies to that food that's being transported within the United States. The receiver means any person who receives food at a point in the U.S. after transportation, whether or not that person represents the final point of receipt for the food. One more definition for you. Transportation. Transportation means the movement of food by motor vehicle or rail vehicle in commerce within the United States. And I forgot to mention, you've all used chat, so please feel free to type any questions. Someone asked, will we be able to receive the material? For records of training, that's an interesting question. I'm assuming you would like, this is actually not a training, this is a presentation, and it's an informational presentation, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about training that is associated with the Sanitary Transport Rule. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available to you on our website after we've uploaded it to our website after the recording. Okay, so who else is covered? Okay, the final rule applies to persons, shippers who ship food into the U.S. directly by motor or rail rail vehicle through Canada and to and from Canada and Mexico, and by ship or air, and if that shipper arranges for the transfer of the intact container onto a motor or rail vehicle for transportation within the United States, if that food will be consumed or distributed in the United States, only the motor and rail portion. So all those shipping containers that you see up on the screen on that ship, if they're offloaded, I happen to live in a little town that is a huge port, and we receive a lot of shipping containers. A lot of cargo ships come through the Carquinez Straits. I live right on the Carquinez Straits. And so we get to see all the shipping containers offloaded. If those containers are offloaded onto a truck, a motor vehicle, or a rail and transported, let's say here into San Francisco or Oakland and offloaded, then they are covered by the transport rule. If they are offloaded onto a truck or a train that's going up to Canada, they are not covered by the rule, sanitary transport rule, because they're transshipped, so to speak. And my next slide is going to talk about transshipments. So shippers, receivers, or carriers with transportation operations with less than $50,000 in average annual revenue are not covered under the sanitary transport rule. So transportation activities performed by a farm are not covered under this rule. Transshipments of food through the U.S. These are regulated by customs and border patrols. So food coming from Mexico, which is headed to Canada, is not covered under this rule because it is transshipped through the U.S. Food not consumed in the U.S., whether it's being imported, transshipped, or exported, so food imported for reprocessing but will not be consumed in the U.S. because it's going to be exported, is not covered under this rule. I want you to remember that the primary focus of this rule is to maintain the safety of the product as it is going through the U.S. transportation system. Okay, some other things not covered. So transportation of food which is fully enclosed by a container, except if it's requiring temperature control. So if you're transporting a case of ground beef, even though it's completely enclosed by a container, it requires temperature control. So it is covered. Live food animals, so basically livestock. So any livestock that is being transported is not covered except for live molluscan shellfish, which of course requires temperature controls. Compressed gases, food gases like maybe oxygen, nitrogen, those gases that are used in the production or preservation of food and food contact substances are not covered under the rule. And then if you are producing human food and the byproducts are going into animal food and you're not further processing that food, it is also not covered. So if you've got cold produce, you've got spent grains from, let's say, beer production, and you're not doing anything else to it but preserving it, utilizing, of course, good manufacturing practices to store it, and then transporting it, it is also not covered under the sanitary transport rule. Let me just take a quick check of my chat here. Okay, I must have said something incorrect. I meant 500,000. Did I? If I said 50,000, I meant 500,000. I think the slide. Yeah, the slide is right. It was the presenter that was wrong, okay? I misspoke. So less than 500,000 in average annual revenue, not 50. The slide was right. So I've corrected myself. So this is recorded. You caught my mistake. Okay, so examples of types of foods subject to the final rule. So foods transported in bulk. What are some examples of foods transported in bulk? So think liquid eggs, like the picture of that truck right there. Liquid eggs, oil, milk, beverages that are being transported. So basically anything that is enclosed by a container, and the container is actually touching the food. Okay, so food directly in contact with the walls of the vehicle. Okay, packaged foods not fully enclosed by a container. So let's say fresh produce. So bags of apples or bags of potatoes or boxes of fresh produce. They're covered under the rule. Foods that require temperature control. I mentioned protein foods like ground meat or your holiday turkeys coming up. They're transported under temperature control requiring temperature control, so they are covered under the rule. Again, sanitary and safe. That's what this rule addresses. Is the food being transported in a way that it is being kept safe from a food safety perspective? So if it's a food that is potentially contaminated with bacteria or it is inherent to the food product, the bacteria must not be given an opportunity to grow, so it must be kept in a controlled temperature environment or a temperature controlled environment. And then of course the sanitation piece has to do with the sanitation of the transport vehicle so that the food is not going to be subject to cross-contamination. So what are some of the key requirements of the sanitary transport rule? So we're going to be looking at the vehicles and the equipment that is used to transport food. We want to look at the design, maintenance, and storage. It must be appropriate to prevent the food from becoming unsafe during transportation operations. Makes sense, right? For food requiring temperature control, vehicles and transportation equipment must be equipped as necessary to provide adequate temperature control. Now, how are we going to check on those things? Okay, some more key requirements. Transportation operations conducted to protect food, ensuring adequate temperature control. So we all know what the temperature danger zone is, I think, what's the temperature danger zone, just to make sure I know you're listening. Type into chat, what is the temperature danger zone? The temperatures where we want to keep the food out of that particular temperature danger zone. Type into chat. Okay, no one's, okay, great. Thank you, Lori. To be clear, if I am importing totes of drums for oils, dry ingredients, that is considered fully enclosed. Totes or drums for oils. I think you're saying drums of oil and maybe totes of dry ingredients or both. That is considered fully enclosed. Yes, that is considered fully enclosed. Okay, the temperature danger zone is 40 to 135 or 41 to 135. So you want to keep food out of that temperature danger zone. So remember, we always say keep hot food hot, cold food cold. So if there are temperature controls required to prevent or reduce a hazard to an acceptable level, which basically we're controlling the growth of bacteria. We want to make sure we maintain those temperatures. We need to make sure we prevent contamination of food by contact with raw foods or non-food items, for instance, like chemicals that are being transported alongside your food, which of course they shouldn't be. Best practice says they shouldn't be, such as cleaning soaps and sanitizers and that sort of thing, pesticides. rodenticides. Protection from cross-contact. So what are we protecting from? We're protecting allergens. We have to make sure there's no cross-contact from food allergens. And then, of course, protection of food transported in bulk. So we have to make sure that while the food is being transported in bulk, and I'm going to talk a little bit about security as well, so locking trailers and locking tanks, that sort of thing. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, more key requirements, transportation operations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the multiple operation requirement and then reassignment of some or all of the responsibilities. So a person or entity may be subject to the transportation operation requirement in multiple capacities. So for instance, if the shipper may also be the loader and the carrier, so then the general responsibilities may be applicable to the shipper, the loader, and the carrier. So designated responsibilities may be assigned, however, that if they are assigned, so for instance, if the shipper who is really bearing the weight, the shipper is the entity that is required to have the process for sanitary transport documented and implemented. But if the shipper in a written agreement wants to transfer that responsibility to another party, for instance, the shipper to the carrier, it must be documented in a written agreement. That's what FDA wants to see. They want to see that documented written agreement to determine who in fact has accepted the responsibility for the sanitary transport of the product. Okay, so some more key requirements: temperature control failure and possible failure leading to unsafe food. So if a shipper, loader, receiver, or carrier becomes aware of a possible material failure of temperature control or other conditions that may render the food unsafe during transportation, the food shall not be sold or otherwise distributed, and whoever becomes aware of the potential danger or contamination or adulteration of the food must take appropriate action. Okay, that could include communicating with the other parties. So maybe the carrier has to communicate with the shipper and the loader to ensure that the food is not sold or otherwise distributed, unless a determination has been made by, and here's the caveat, a qualified individual. So I don't have the definition of a qualified individual up here on this presentation, but that qualified individual, as determined by FDA, has the experience and or education that is necessary to determine whether or not the food is safe. Okay, so the determination must be made by a qualified individual that perhaps the temperature deviation or other conditions in fact did not render the food unsafe. Okay, so general responsibility is applicable to those responsible under the rule. Okay. Again, any questions? I'm checking again to see if there are any questions. Nope, no questions yet. Okay. I will try and get to them as you ask them. All right, carrier capabilities. So let's talk about what needs to happen before transportation, during transportation, and after transportation. So compliance is, as you saw on the third slide I think I showed today at the beginning of the presentation, compliance is mandatory next April 6, 2017, for larger and otherwise non-exempt businesses. And I'm going to tell you who those exempt businesses are. Smaller businesses and motor carriers have until April of 2018 to comply. So basically, the FDA has said the new rule is focused on ensuring that individuals who transport human and animal food. Do we have any animal food transporters or producers here on the call? If you do, just shoot me a note into chat. Okay, animal food. Okay, by motor and rail vehicle, follow appropriate sanitary transportation practices and do not create food safety risks. Okay, so what are the key requirements for the shipper? Okay, as I said earlier, the shipper must develop and implement written procedures subject to the records requirements of FSMA, and they must be adequate enough to ensure that the vehicles and the equipment are in appropriate sanitary condition. Now, what does that mean, appropriate sanitary condition? Just doesn't mean that they're clean. It also means that they're free of any debris, that they're basically in good shape. They're capable of transporting food and not adulterating or contaminating it. They must also ensure that a previous cargo does not make food transported in bulk unsafe. So the previous load. So way back I think it was probably in the early to mid 1990s, there was a manufacturer who transported pasteurized liquid ice cream in a tanker. They didn't know what was in that tanker previously. They were shipping it from one location to another location for it to be packaged and frozen. So it was liquid ice cream that had been pasteurized already. Put it into a tanker. Major foodborne illness outbreak that was attributed to, it was a salmonellosis that was attributed to this particular producer. Ice cream again, isn't that sad? Anyway, so what they traced it back to was that the previous load in that tanker had been liquid eggs. The tanker was not cleaned properly. It was not in good condition. There were fissures within in the interior of the tanker, contaminated that pasteurized liquid product that was not going to go through any kind of a kill step again. It was going to be packaged and frozen. Foodborne illness outbreak. Okay, so that's what they mean by the previous load. Food requiring temperature control for safety is transported under adequate temperature control. But again, the shipper is responsible for the development and implementation of the written procedures. Okay, also before transportation, best practices indicate that you may have a truck with the latest technology, you may not. But if you have temperature monitoring devices within that truck, you have to make sure that they're working appropriately. As I said, I was going to talk a little bit about locks and seals. Although proper locking and sealing is not covered under the sanitary transport rule, may be included in guidance under the intentional adulteration rule, which is basically that food defense rule that I had talked about earlier. So the materials within the vehicle must be cleaned and sanitized appropriately for food transportation. And again, what do you do if, for instance, there's a breakdown? So preventive maintenance is very important. Preventive maintenance for your shipping vehicle is very important. And then is RFID or other technology available for traceability? Okay, so we know in the produce industry, traceability, well, we know traceability is part of the preventive controls rule as well as the produce safety rule. So there are requirements for traceability. Are you using radio frequency to ID your product? Okay, so shipper, before transportation, shipper documents the appropriate standards and tolerances for what the product is being transported in. So temperature, sanitation condition of the trailer, condition of the rail car. Okay, so documents and standards and tolerances, and document the procedures related to equipment cleaning and prior cargo hauled. Okay, again, still before shipping, before transportation, evaluate carriers and other vendors. So is your receiver, does the receiver have on their end a preventive controls qualified individual on the team? It's not necessary under this particular act, but that's just a question you might want to ask yourself. Has there been documented personnel training on sanitary procedures? And we're going to talk about the training requirements under this rule specifically. Is there a continuous temperature monitoring device? So do they provide visibility, continuous temperature monitoring, documentation? So those are all the questions you need to ask yourself. So again, here are some more key roles I want to talk to you about. So the loaders. The loaders are responsible for inspecting the vehicle at loading. They're looking for cleanliness, and is there a requirement for pre-cooling that vehicle or that trailer? Receivers, upon receipt, they need to assess the food for any kind of potential adulteration, so that would include damage, as well as temperature abuse. And then the carriers, upon request if agreed to, they need to demonstrate that the shipper's operating temperature requirements have been met, and they disclose identity of the most prior bulk cargo and the cleaning information. So that lies with the carrier. So we're going to talk in a second about what else is required of the carrier. So the carrier is required to train their personnel. Okay, so training is required just for the carrier. When the carrier and shipper have agreed in a written contract that the carrier is responsible in whole or in part for the sanitary condition during transportation, carrier personnel must be provided with adequate, and as we all know, if it's not written down, it didn't happen, so adequate and documented training on sanitary transportation practices and awareness of potential food safety problems that may occur during food transport. So, for training, if you're aware of the other rules, the preventive controls rule, produce safety rule, you know that FDA is working with the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance and with the Produce Safety Alliance. They have developed training materials for preventive controls and for produce safety. The Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance, or FSPCA, is also working on training for Foreign Supplier Verification Program. FDA envisions, I'm not sure whether the entity will be the FSPCA or whom it will be, they envision offering basically a 1-hour online training to have carriers meet the training requirement under this rule. So the training will basically be based on how to establish potential preventive measures for any potential problems and how to respond to those problems. So you're not going to be asked to go to a 1-day or even a half-day training. FDA envisions doing something like that online, making sure you've documented the training for your employee if you're a carrier, and making sure that it's available to FDA if they should ask for it. Okay, so Todd asked the question, when shipping product, does the carrier have to supply documentation of what has been carried in a particular trailer or truck? A tanker. In a tanker. So as I said, the example that I gave of the eggs and the pasteurized ice cream, that's where they would have to provide a previous load. So, but under best practices, those of us who are involved in the Global Food Safety Initiative are well aware of the fact that you want to know what your previous load is if you're shipping something that is a potentially hazardous food. But the requirement under the sanitary transport rule is for cargo. Tanker. I keep saying cargo. Tanker. So let's talk about what the key requirements are for the shipper. So the shipper needs to provide information to the carrier. So records that demonstrate that the shipper provides information to carriers about the necessary sanitary requirements for the vehicle, necessary temperature conditions for temperature-controlled foods, evidence that the shipper provides information to the carrier. So FDA wants to see evidence, documented evidence, that the shipper has provided this information to the carrier. It's not necessary for the shipper to provide instruction for each load, but FDA wants to know that there's a documented relationship between the shipper and the carrier, and that instructions have been provided by the shipper. Remember, the shipper is the one who is responsible for providing the documentation. The carrier must provide training for their employees. Okay, the electronic records, fortunately, do not have to be part of Section 11 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Off-site storage of records, this is just sort of talking about the records, off-site storage of records must be retrievable, as with the other FSMA rules, within 24 hours of request by FDA. Okay, I think I have another question. Oh, no, it's a thank you. You're welcome. Okay, more key requirements for records for the carriers. So SOPs for cleaning and inspection of vehicles, temperature conditions, bulk cargo protection, and training records. So carriers, again, enter into a written agreement with the shipper. So the carrier, so the shipper develops the plan for maintaining sanitary operations of the transport vehicle. The carrier should be developing written SOPs for cleaning and inspection of the vehicles, and that describes how it will meet the requirements to provide information to the shippers about temperature conditions and bulk cargo protection as appropriate. So agreements with the shippers. So you have to have an agreement with the carrier, has an agreement with the shipper, records that would be a one-time deal. So FDA does not anticipate that there are a lot of documents associated with this rule. If you have a relationship with, if you're a shipper and you have a relationship with a carrier and vice versa, you enter into an agreement with them. It doesn't need to be an agreement that's rehashed every time you actually carry for a particular shipper. However, carriers need to communicate information back to the shipper if a question comes up, for instance, about temperature control during shipment. So training requirements, again, for the carrier must be documented, and there are no other training requirements. There is no shipper requirement because there are other regulations under FSMA that the shipper and receiver would have to comply with, so with the produce safety rule or the preventive controls rule. Okay. All right, so during transportation. So what's the sanitation between loads? So has the trailer been cleaned and sanitized, or at least cleaned between loads? Cleaning will vary, again, on the types of food, and equipment must be kept free of contaminants. So if we're looking at a trailer, we're looking at a rail car, what's the sanitation requirement, or what's the sanitation condition of that particular vehicle? Again, proper temperature, and has the temperature been maintained and documented throughout the trip? How are products being stored within that trailer? Is raw meat, poultry, and seafood kept separate from ready-to-eat foods? Is there verification of that? Is inspection or verification done during each handoff? Who has the authority and the responsibility if a load cannot be accepted? Is the trailer pre-cooled? Another question. If the trailer needs to be pre-cooled, it's pre-cooled as necessary, and is there documentation associated with that? Okay, what happens when there are multiple stops, deliveries? So it's really up to, and this is all best practice that we're talking about now. Optimize your routes. Make sure that a carrier could be making 15 stops in 90-degree heat and opening that trailer every time and keeping it open for several months. Temperatures going up. So optimize your routes. Provide precise delivery times and expectations for your receivers. Minimize loading and unloading time. Do everything as quickly as possible, and then, of course, keep the door closed when possible, and consider using a ramp instead of using a lift. A lift takes a little bit longer, a lift gate, and so you would use a ramp to minimize hot air blowing back into the trailer if you've got a temperature-controlled trailer. What do you do in case of an emergency? What do you do in case there's a breakdown? Okay, there should be a plan in place. Contingency plans. So even best-in-class response may be 2 hours. So roadside assistance may be 2 hours. You may be sitting there with a broken-down truck. And your product may be there may be temperature abuse going on. So have a plan. Be proactive. Remember, the The function of FSMA is prevention. And how do we prevent something? We identify the potential for it happening, and then we put a plan in place to prevent it from happening. Okay, so there are some waivers. So the agency may waive the requirements of the rule if it determines that the waiver will not result in transportation of food under conditions that would be unsafe for humans or animals. So the types of transportation that are addressed in other cooperative programs might be included in these waivers. So waiver notices have not yet been finalized, and they will be published and finalized prior to the compliance date, again, which is April 6th of 2017. So the agency intends to publish the waivers in the Federal Register as they announced in the proposed rule. Okay, so what is included in the waiver? Okay, so what's included in the waiver, and again, these will be published in the Federal Register, shippers, carriers, and receivers who hold valid permits and are inspected under the National Conference on Interstate Milk Shipments Grade A Milk Safety Program. So the waiver only applies when Grade A milk and milk products, so for this particular product. FDA absolutely acknowledges that the controls for such transportation operations already exist under this program, and there's oversight by the state and FDA. So let's see, do I have another one? Yeah, okay. So the other waivers apply to retail stores, restaurants, home grocery delivery, who are holding valid permits. So if you're holding a valid permit issued by a relevant regulatory agency such as a state or tribal agency, when engaged as receivers, shippers, and carriers in operations in which food is relinquished to customers after being transported, there is a waiver issued. So examples could be restaurants, supermarkets, home grocery delivery, which I have listed there. FDA acknowledges there are controls in place for transportation of these types of operations under the Retail Food Program within each state, territory, and local enforcement and oversight by FDA. So the initial proposed rule actually excluded loaders. So loaders are now, based on comments received under the proposed rule, loaders are now, they've been added as a covered party. So the loader, again, must determine that the transportation equipment is in appropriate sanitary condition and, if it's applicable, adequately prepared for refrigerated transportation. So the final rule, again, is focused solely on sanitary transportation practices that are necessary to ensure that food remains safe. Okay, compliance dates. We've already talked about this initially, but the compliance dates are for small businesses. You've got 2 years, which would be 2018. So businesses, this is the definition by the Small Business Administration, businesses employing fewer than 500 full-time employees, except carriers by motor vehicle that are not also shippers and or receivers. So motor vehicle carriers that are not also shippers and or receivers having less than 27.5 million in annual sales. Other businesses, 1 year, so not small and otherwise excluded or waivers. Okay, I don't think I have any more questions. Okay, guidance. I think, in my humble opinion, as somebody who's been involved in food safety for many years, I am actually very impressed with the type of guidance and the type of training that FDA has partnered with organizations like the FSPCA and the Produce Safety Alliance, and they are issuing guidance. For those of you who are required to comply with the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule, they are issuing basically potential hazard guidance. If you're familiar with the seafood HACCP rule and the seafood HACCP guide, or excuse me, hazards guide, FDA is coming out with something very similar for preventive controls. So FDA is also coming out with a small entity compliance guide, And the Sanitary Transportation of Food Guide, really, they've had a long time to work on this because, remember I said earlier, it's the Sanitary Food Transportation Act of 2005 that this rule is actually based on. Okay, so that's our presentation for today. I've left some time for questions. If you have any questions, you can ask me in chat. Or I would absolutely write down this address, the FDA TAN or Technical Assistance Network. You can contact them at fda.gov/FSMA, or you can contact me, and whoops, I did that wrong thing there. I want to tell you about our webinar series. Touch Base Tuesday is the third Tuesday of each month. Next month we'll be sort of encapsulating food safety in 2016. It's been a quite active, lively year for food safety in the U.S. and beyond, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's happened in the last year. And if you're interested in our webinar series, we are offering, I'm actually going to be teaching this class as a webinar, Food Safety Fundamentals, which basically covers GMPs and SSOPs and some other prerequisite programs, and internal auditing for those of you who are GFSI certified, and then we'll be offering a validation and verification for your food safety plan in February of 2017. I know those of you who are under the preventive controls rule know you have to validate and verify your food safety plan. Let's see, other questions coming up in chat. Okay, and then finally, if you're interested in any of our live on-site courses, you can contact Diane, our training services manager, and if you're interested in any of our other services, please contact Bernadette, who is up on our screen right now. So I'm not seeing, oh wait. Here's a good question. Any webinars on foreign supplier verification program? We've got one coming up in 2017. Okay, so Marisol, how can the webinar again? This is going to be on our website. I am recording this webinar right now, so it will be on, excuse me, it will be on our website. So check our website under resources, and you can listen to the whole thing again. Okay, you're welcome, Marisol. Okay, I will be on to answer any questions for a few more minutes. If you have questions, please type them into chat. If not, thank you so much for attending my webinar, and I hope you'll join us for a Touch Base Tuesday again, whether it be next month for our recap of food safety, or maybe you'll hear my voice again on one of our SCS food safety webinars. Thank you, and by the way, happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Annette, my email address is, where is my email address? I don't have, oh, there it is. Okay, yeah, that's my email address. Why don't you send me an email? And then we can arrange something. Thanks, Maria Elena. Again, I'll stay on for a few more minutes if you have any questions.